Hello, Connecting Point. I'm hoping to start us off today with a table talk question, which will prime our pumps for the two sections of 2 Samuel that we're going to be looking at today. Our text is 2 Samuel 21, so here's the table talk to start off with. What do the forces of evil look like? And how do we deal with them as people of faith? Go ahead and take a minute for that. Okay, so before we jump into our text, I want to point out some of the interesting structural details from the text as we come towards the end of our study in the life of David. So we're picking up our study in 2 Samuel 21, and we've arrived at this interesting point. You'll recall last week that we ended off 2 Samuel chapter 20, ends with a list of David's officials, which follows another story where we see David's kingdom is upheld against a rebellion by the cynical but controlled application of violence by David's chief military man, Joab. So that end of chapter 20, the scholars note that it's really marking a break point in the narrative that is picked up again at 1 Kings chapter 1. So what we're left with in 2 Samuel is 4 more chapters, 21, 22, 23, and 24. And these are divided into 6 segments that act something like an appendix or a coda or an epilogue to the narrative that we've been following now from the beginning of 1 Samuel 1. So those 50 previous chapters, 50-ish. So commentators are somewhat divided over exactly what these stories are saying and doing because they don't seem to fit in with the stylistic form that we've seen throughout the rest of the tale so far. So just so you can kind of see what's going on, here's a bit of like a structural summary of what happens in these 6 sections. So the commentators like to point out that there's a chiastic format used. And remember, that's this kind of inverted V shape, and you'll see it on the slide. This is a sensible thing to see here. Remember that the main point of a chiastic structure is often found in the center, and this is a typical ancient world, but especially ancient Hebrew mode of communicating ideas. So here's how the structure works for these last 4 chapters. Part A is the first story that we're going to look at today, chapter 21, verses 1 to 14. And what we'll see is David saves Israel from a disaster, a famine in this case, through retributive justice against Saul's family for Saul's crimes. In part B, which will be the second part of our text today, chapter 21, verses 15 to 22, we have a list of David's soldiers who fought with giants from among the Philistines. Keep that word giants in your mind. Part C we'll be looking at next week, which is chapter 22, and it's a song of David, and it's a parallel with Psalm 18. So you can go read, more or less exactly what it says in another section in the Bible, which outlines and defines his trust in God as his refuge. Then we have what would be called C prime, or the second C, and that's another poem. It's David's final words outlining his legitimacy because of his faithfulness. Then we have B prime, which is a list of the exploits of David's mighty warriors who enabled and empowered his rule and conquests during his lifetime. Then in A prime, you have chapter 24, which is where David foolishly takes a census and incurs God's wrath, but then saves Israel through a repentant act of faithfulness. And so you see kind of like this parallel structure between all of these different stories. Now, it's significant that there's no clear timeline of when exactly within David's reign all of these different stories or things were to have taken place. So you can kind of make guesses or inferences about when it was all happening. It kind of doesn't matter on some level. Obviously it matters, but for what the story is trying to tell you, they're included in this section as a coda for reasons that were clear to the authors, and so the commentators have been trying to understand what those reasons were in the years that have followed. So one of the reasons that the commentators are divided on this section, this coda or this epilogue or this set of appendixes, is because you can read these stories either from a more critical perspective or a more uncritical perspective. So I'll kind of outline those two ideas just so you can see the way that the Bible is wrangled over, and I'll try to offer a little bit of insight, but for whatever it's worth, take it for what it is, one man's opinion, right? So the uncritical, or the more traditional interpretation of these sections, is that David's heroism and virtue is once again shown through these little snippets. But the critical interpretation comes more from the 19th and 20th centuries, the literary critical movement, which sees that the structural differences point to a later inclusion of these stories, and that these later inclusions are written after David has died, and that they're there to kind of complicate David's legacy. This movement, the literary critical movement, was heavily influenced by a more materialistic, as opposed to what they would call a superstitious worldview, but I would maybe describe that worldview as like enchanted or spiritually rich or multifaceted or symbolic. They see David's story as being written by court stenographers who are acting as like propagandists to prop up a king who had usurped a throne from another family. So they like this idea of complicating David's legacy by showing his weakness or his other character flaws. Now, I think these are rich enough stories that we're going to see elements of both here. I don't know, like I've expressed this before, but I want to reiterate that I don't really like either of these positions, to just see David as hero or to just see David as villain who's a propagandist and telling his own story. I don't think either of those things is helpful or accurate. So what we're given is the Bible that God intended us to have. So we should take things at face value, but with an eye to deepening our understanding of what the authors are and were trying to do. David was a usurper of Saul's throne, who was a Benjamite, right? But he was also the correct inheritor of the crown, because the crown had always been intended to come from the tribe of Judah instead of Benjamin. And then David was anointed by God through God's selected messenger, this man Samuel, who was, everyone in Israel knew, he was the anointer of the king. And he had anointed Saul as well. And Saul had failed, and Samuel told him as much. And David was then brought in as a replacement royal family, basically. I've heard one person recently call David a, quote, horrible Iron Age warlord, unquote, which I guess sometimes he kind of is, but David is also the model citizen of Israel that is upheld by the later scriptures, 1st, 2nd Kings, the Chronicles, as we get into the New Testament as well, which are making something of a commentary on this whole story. Why is this? It's because we see that David, after all of the mess that he makes of his life, is in fact a man after God's heart. So it's too simplistic to just call David hero or usurper. You need to read the whole story. And you need to read the whole Bible to understand what they're trying to do with a person like David. The story of the state of ancient Israel is not merely a human military political history. It's also a prophetic story, and it is unique among nations for this. All of the ancient historians will note Israel's uniqueness in that they highlight the weakness of their kings rather than prop up some mythical lie about what their kings were really like. The dynasty is never shown to be perfect. David badly flops almost immediately following his receipt of God's beautiful promise to him, which we read about in 2 Samuel 7, to build a never-ending kingdom through his family and his line. And David deals with terrible consequences for years following. And we've just finished reading about all of that political turmoil that came about as a consequence of David's poor decision-making and moral failure. So we also see correctly that David is upheld as something of a model because of the texts like the one that we're going to read in 2 Samuel 22 next week, where we're going to see David think about carefully, how do you deal with evil in your life? And so this hopefully that's a bit of a ground setter for the next couple of weeks. And hopefully it makes some sense of where I stand on the whole question of critical or uncritical interpretations of these stories. So just keep in mind this, next week as we come to 2 Samuel 22, we're going to be talking about David's where David really is exemplary in his poetry and in the underlying thinking that is going into his living. And he lives it out very imperfectly. And we're going to see an example of that again this week. But this week we're going to see a few instances where David is stuck dealing with evil on some level. And next week we're going to kind of revisit the idea, but from his poetry. So let's read the first part of our text, and I'll make a couple of comments and send you to another table talk. During David's reign, there was a famine for 3 consecutive years. So David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said, "It is because of Saul and his blood-stained family, because he murdered the Gibeonites." So the king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke with them. Now the Gibeonites were not descendants of Israel. They were a remnant of the Amorites. The Israelites had made a promise to them, but Saul tried to kill them because of his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, "What can I do for you, and how can I make amends, so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites said to him, "We have no claim to silver or gold from Saul or from his family, nor would we be justified in putting to death anyone in Israel." So David asked, "What then are you asking me to do for you?" They replied to the king, "Well, as for this man who exterminated us and who schemed against us so that we were destroyed and left without status throughout all the borders of Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be turned over to us, and we will execute them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, who was the Lord's chosen one." And the king replied, "I will turn them over." The king had mercy on Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, in light of the Lord's oath that had been taken between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Aiah's daughter, Rizpah, whom she had borne to Saul, and then the 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Meholathite. He turned them over to the Gibeonites, and they executed them on a hill before the Lord. The 7 of them died together. They were put to death during harvest time, during the first days of the beginning of the barley harvest. Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock. From the beginning of the harvest until the rain fell on them, she did not allow the birds of the air to feed on them by day, nor the wild animals by night. When David was told what Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, Saul's concubine, had done, he went and took the bones of Saul and of his son Jonathan from the leaders of Jabesh Gilead. They had secretly taken them from the plaza at Bethshan. It was there that Philistines publicly exposed their corpses after they had killed Saul at Gilboa. David brought the bones of Saul and of Jonathan, his son, from there. They also gathered up the bones of those who had been executed. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin at Zelah, in the grave of his father Kish. After they had done everything that the king had commanded, God responded to their prayers for the land. So a little reflection on this story will probably lead you to see how this is at least somewhat controversial. David turns Israelites over to a non-Israelite group as something of a blood offering. That's enough already to make us kind of uncomfortable. Making it even worse is that we don't have a record of Saul's oppression / genocide of the Gibeonites earlier in the Samuel narrative. One would think that maybe this should be in there, but we don't have a full and exhaustive record of Saul's 40 plus years as king. So this combination of factors has led some scholars to think that perhaps this whole thing was a convenient excuse / propagandistic effort for David to further decimate Saul's household. And you know, that's one kind of opinion on the whole thing. I don't think I'm very comfortable with that interpretation. I think David already looks bad enough between the whole Uriah Bathsheba affair that we saw earlier in the story, and then his failures to uphold justice towards his horrible sons Adonijah and Absalom. We don't need to read more evil onto him to already think that he's got his share of failures. So let's note a couple of mitigating factors about this story before we think about it some more. So the first one is that the Gibeonites, like it said in the text, are these people who are not Hebrews, they're Amorites or remnants of the Amorites. But they had a long-standing deal with the Hebrews dating back over 400 years to the time of the initial conquest under Joshua. So long-standing, you're allowed to live in the land, and the Israelites had made a covenant with them, like to uphold their status within the land, not as full citizens, but as second-class citizens. But their to be allowed to live in the land. And God honors the Israelites for upholding their word to the Gibeonites. Saul's zeal is noted as not being for the Lord. Rather, it's a nationalistic, or you might say racialized in our modern context, zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. So what we've seen throughout the story of David is that David is shown as the king of the people who abide by the covenant, right? Foreigners are always and repeatedly being brought in as we've gone through David's story. And we see that David is foreshadowing what Jesus does, how Jesus breaks the covenant of Israel open to all peoples with his death and resurrection and with pouring out his Holy Spirit upon all of mankind in the book of Acts. And David is foreshadowing that. And so what we see here is that David is caught in this horrible dilemma as he's shown needing to find a means to uphold his promises to Jonathan particularly, and to the memory of Saul, but also to the principles of justice, if this whole story has in fact a grounding, which we might as well assume it does. So this he does, more or less, I would say. So Saul's family is punished as his concubine sons are offered up to the Gibeonites as a blood guilt offering, basically. And then David is able to uphold his promise to Jonathan, which he had reaffirmed to Mephibosheth, and you can read about that earlier in 2 Samuel 9, I believe. So we saw that in the last chapter, chapter 20, the previous week, that it was in fact a Benjamite, this guy named Sheba, who was leading the last rebellion against David of the 10 northern tribes of Israel before Joab received his Sheba's head from that wise woman of Abel Beth Maacah. Maybe this whole story of Saul's family's continuing ongoing mistreatment, if you would put it that way, is part of this open sore between the Judahite David and the Benjamites, who kind of keep on being a problem. What we see though is that David is also able to honor the love of the bereaved mother, Rizpah, whose actions demonstrate her care for her sons. So what we have happening at the end of the text there is that Saul and Jonathan are finally gathered back up, their remains, by the state of Israel, right? They had been gathered by their kinsmen from the Philistines, who had been displaying them as trophies, which, I guess gross, but Iron Age. So there we are. David finally gives them a state burial, along with these illegitimate grandsons of Saul, these concubines' sons, that were sacrificed here to deal with the blood guilt that's incurred by Saul's treatment of the Gibeonites. So before our table talk, I have one more thought that I want to offer. Here we see David trying to deal with evil in the state of Israel. This evil was not perpetrated by his actions particularly, but his response is supposed to act to reconcile the Gibeonites back into the covenant with the rest of the Israelites. He also tries to, split the baby to steal a story from his son, Solomon, as it were, and then do right by his commitments to honor Saul and especially Jonathan. In our day, I don't think we would be comfortable with reparations being delivered by a state execution. That seems a little bit barbaric or uncivilized. But we do see similar practices occasionally. I'm thinking about in recent Canadian history, we've had Prime Minister Harper's apology to the First Nations for the residential schools, his official state apology for what happened with the residential schools, or then Prime Minister Trudeau's putting the flags at half-mast after the discovery of the controversial ground up in the interior of BC that anyhow, your mileage is going to vary, of course, with those different acts, probably depending on your particular political persuasions. But there does seem to be an extra layer of thinking that goes into a question like, how do you deal with past wrongs? And especially if you're thinking about past wrongs that are not your personal responsibility, but you represent an organization that is in fact responsible for these past wrongs. So how do you deal with past wrongs? Maybe those that weren't done by you. Does this equation for thinking about this question change if you're in position of authority over others? And then maybe if you don't want to go into something as abstract as that and personal as that, maybe think about this. Do you think David's approach here was justifiable or correct? Is there a principle that can be taken out of this, but maybe the practice was gross and only culturally acceptable because of the time period? I don't know. Talk about something to do with that, and we'll come back and finish up the chapter. Okay, let's read the follow-up story and finish up chapter 21. Another battle was fought between the Philistines and Israel. So David went down with his soldiers and fought the Philistines. David became exhausted. Now Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, had a spear that weighed 300 bronze shekels, and he was armed with a new weapon. He had said that he would kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to David's aid, striking the Philistine down and killing him. And then David's men took an oath, saying, "You will not go out to battle with us again. You must not extinguish the lamp of Israel." Later, there was another battle with the Philistines, this time in Gob. On that occasion, Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, who was one of the descendants of Rapha. Yet another battle occurred with the Philistines in Gob. On that occasion, Elhanan, the son of Jair the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Yet another battle occurred in Gath. On that occasion, there was a large man who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He too was a descendant of Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of David's brother, Shimeah, killed him. These 4 were the descendants of Rapha who lived in Gath, and they were killed by David and his soldiers. Now I will say that this is a super tantalizing passage of Scripture, and it does have its share of controversy around it. It's not exactly clear what all is going on with these particular enemies of Israel whose deaths are chronicled in this text, and there's quite a bit of controversy exactly how we should translate some of these sentences. So if you're interested, I can talk to you more. You can email our Gmail account, and I'll interact with you on that. But however, what we do gather from this section is that the author identifies these fellows as being related to Goliath, at least on some level. And Goliath, of course, the story of David and Goliath is the place where we begin the legend of David in a lot of ways, right? It's his first real public action as someone who's an up-and-comer within Israel. So it's possible that these were 5 brothers, blood brothers or something like that, or cousins, among whom Goliath was the eldest and most famous. And there's some suggestion that this is one of the reasons why David took 5 stones in the story that you can read in 1 Samuel 17. The nerve of David, though, if that's really what happened, is like, well, there's Goliath and there's his 4 brothers who are all huge, so I better take 5 stones, 1 for each guy, because I don't think I can take any out 2 for 1. I don't know. David, the nerve of David, if that's what's going on. Anyhow, another possibility is that these are, in fact, descendants of those mysterious Nephilim from Genesis chapter 6, who are recorded in that place as fallen angels of some variety, or these anti-human giants who copulated with human women. And anyhow, that whole topic is really interesting, and there's lots of speculation on it these days and whatnot. So if you're curious, I can suggest some things to go check out, but some of which are a little crazy and some are more grounded. But anyhow, the phrase that we see there as descendants of Rapha is this phrase Harapha, or Rephaim, meaning dead ones. And it's related to this phrase Nephilim, and these mysterious characters have invited much speculation, some of which I'm not really comfortable endorsing. What is clear as you look at them, though, is that these are champions who have set themselves in opposition to God and the purposes of God. So the question that we're left with is, how is evil like that to be dealt with? In this case, what we see is that David, first with Goliath, and then now his mighty warriors of the later generation, they went ahead and slew these giants. I don't really buy the revisionist interpretation of this section, which is trying to show that David is weak by setting this narrative as like, David couldn't deal with these guys and he had to have his other guys. I think we're on safer ground seeing that David's victory over Goliath becomes a point of reference for these later battles as they're fought. And the men of Israel developed the courage and the strategies to deal with the problem of these mighty, gigantic enemies. We even learn that two of David's kinsmen are the guys who take up the mantle, as Abishai, who you remember is Joab's brother, which is like a sister son of David, like a nephew kind of a thing, saves David, who's now old, from being taken down by this Ishbi-Benob character in the first anecdote that we're given in this. And then later on we see that David's brother, Shimeah, has a son whose name is Jonathan, no less, and he takes down the guy who has the 24 digits. So I want to suggest that this idea of the point of reference is the context that we find ourselves in as we think about how these stories operate as a part of Holy Scripture. The stories are here as meditation literature. They invite us to reflect on human nature, the problem of evil in its many forms, and how to live a life of faithfulness as we encounter different problems in our lives. It doesn't shy away from these problems being real, right? How do these actions that we see here today point to the perfect actions of Jesus as a starting spot for thinking about this? Well, I think we see an obvious thought about Jesus providing the blood of a king, in this case his own blood, as a blood guilt offering for the evil perpetrated, if you wanted to take a parallel out of that first story. We could also think about Jesus' role as destroying death and guilt, the guilt of our sin, which are truly the biggest giants that we face in our lives, through his death and resurrection. But from there, we can begin to reflect on how David, in his imperfect way, but aiming at faithfulness, is a starting point for us to be thinking about how we can wisely and faithfully deal with the forces of evil in our own lives. And I don't want you to kid yourself about this. We're all in a fight with the forces of evil every day. I've heard it described that as you walk down the street, everyone you meet is in a fight for their life. And I think that's basically true. Now, these forces of evil don't always come at us in the shape of a gigantic fallen angel, but we do see three different instances of how evil is encountered in these stories, and it's worth reflecting a little more on them before we finish up today. So maybe we're like the state of Israel, and we've inflicted an evil on ourselves, right? Israel had allowed Saul to persecute the Gibeonites, and in whatever it was that his blood feud with them was. So maybe we've done that to ourselves. Maybe we've done something and now we're stuck dealing with the consequences of our own ill behavior, our own moral depravity, our own failure, right? Maybe we're dealing with evil that's like a leftover from someone else's evil that they've done. Maybe we're left cleaning up a mess, like what David is stuck doing in that first story with the Gibeonites. David's on the hook for trying to figure out how to make amends to this bereaved people group for actions that he didn't commit. And like, what do you do in a situation where you're stuck dealing with the consequences of some other person's evil? But maybe it's actually the forces of, spiritual forces of evil, like we see embodied in the Philistine giants, that had to be dealt with, right? They had to be slain for the people of God to be able to expand their territory, to live in their lives of faithfulness in peace and security and prosperity. Now, not all of us are called to do all of these things all of the time. We're not always like self-inflicting a bunch of evil, although probably quite often we are. But we're not always going to be called to fight demons or Nephilim or all those kinds of things. I would guess that most of us aren't going to have to fight a giant in our lifetimes. But on some level, we are all in the fight. So I want you to take some time to pray about this as we end our time today. If you're seeing this pattern, any of these patterns manifest in your life, I mean, you know that there's evil that needs to be dealt with in your life. You know there's evil in your own heart that still needs to be dealt with. You know that you're left dealing with the leftovers of other people's evil sometimes. And you know that there's evil out there that just wants to harm you, right? Now, it needs to be dealt with. How do we go about doing that? So let's have a table talk about that. Is there some way that you're seeing the forces of evil at work in your life context? Now, I want you to also pray for God's victory in that. Pray for his good and perfect will to be done in your life, and that you'll grow in wisdom as to how to live into that victory that God promises us in your context. And we'll come back next week to do a little more reflection on how David went and started to become wise towards this. All right, have yourselves a great week.